Okay, so it's been a minute since I did the last episode of this and the first episode of this, the previous episode of talking about superheroes, and I promised that the next episode would be about Mr. Fantastic. Now, originally my thought was I was going to do an episode about the Fantastic Four, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I could probably get an entire episode just talking about Mr. Fantastic for a bit. And I honestly feel like Mr. Fantastic doesn't get quite as much attention as he deserves. He gets kind of overshadowed by the other three members, which is really ironic considering how one of them is invisible. But he's a really cool character in his own right, so we're going to talk about it. Now, I do feel like that with the Fantastic Four, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and that those characters together form a kind of like magical chemistry, kind of similar to the Beatles, or Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, actually. And going back to the beginning, the Fantastic Four really started with DC Comics and the Justice League of America, oddly enough. Because what had happened was Martin Goodman, who was the publisher of Marvel Comics, went to play golf with, I forget who it was, one of the executives from DC Comics, probably like Jack Leibowitz or somebody. Doesn't really matter as far as the story goes. The point is, this guy from DC Comics was bragging about the success the DC was having with Justice League of America. So Martin Goodman, never being one to not chase a trend, came back to Stan Lee, who was basically, the editor and writer of every single title at Marvel Comics at the time, and said, hey, I need you to create a team of superheroes, because Justice League of America is selling really well, so we need to have a team of superheroes. Now, Stan was at a bit of a disadvantage compared to DC Comics, as DC had already jump-started the Silver Age of comics, and The Flash and Green Lantern were both selling really well. You had Aquaman and the Martian Manhunter, who were both fairly successful backup strips in other comics, and Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman were the only superheroes to continuously have a published title from the Golden Age of comics. So as far as putting together a team of superheroes there, it was a no-brainer. He had a lot to cull from. And in fact, he could have had more, because he forgot about Green Arrow. But Stan didn't have any superhero titles on the stands at the time. It was things like, Millie the Model and, all those monster books that they were putting out. So he had to use a little more imagination. And the first thing he did, which was the smartest thing, well, let me back up a bit. There's one other bit I'm missing. Is, at this time, Stan was growing kind of frustrated with the whole comic book game, and he was ready to pack it in. And his wife basically said, you know what, just write whatever you want. Write the comic book that you want to write, the one that you would want to read. And it was really good advice. Because, she's like, you're going to quit anyway. The worst he can do is fire you. So Stan went ahead and recruited Jack Kirby, and together they created the Fantastic Four. Now, I think the thing that made the Fantastic Four really revolutionary was that Stan was trying to do superheroes in a realistic way. And this was the first time that somebody had really tried to do superheroes in a realistic way. Like, for example, the Fantastic Four did not have costumes. They wore normal clothes. This was something that would change later on. They did not have secret identities. They were public figures. They lived in a skyscraper as opposed to like some kind of bat cave or mountain sanctuary or fortress of solitude. They lived in a skyscraper in the middle of the city, which oddly enough was originally called Central City, but later changed to just being plain old New York City, which was another thing. And they had personal problems, they had disagreements, they had money problems, and it was something that was unique and new and fresh, and I think that was the key to the Fantastic Four's success. The other thing being, the limitless fertile imagination of Jack Kirby. Yeah, I'm sure Stan came up with a lot of stuff too, as far as like, the really wild, wacky stuff. But you gotta imagine most of the really cosmic stuff came from Jack. So, the big broad stuff. And the more sort of human touches, I think that's probably what came from Stan. So, you look at the stuff that they did later on, like, New Gods is pretty much all bombast and big stuff. And, working on, separately from Jack Kirby, on Spider-Man with Steve Ditko and later John Romita, those stories are much more sort of down to earth and about Peter Parker's personal problems. But yeah, together, Stan and Jack created some magic. And Mr. Fantastic is a very interesting character in a lot of ways. He's obviously a very intelligent man, and that's what I think a lot of writers and today kind of pick up on. And but it's not like the people you think of today who are kind of like eggheads and they're kind of nerds. He was more sort of like the sci-fi heroes of 1950s and 60s movies, like This Island Earth and that kind of thing. So he was a very intelligent, very active figure, and he was a World War II veteran. So he was supposed to be a tough guy. He was in the OSS and did a lot of behind the scenes, really top secret kind of stuff. Pretty interesting. So anyway, the origin of the Fantastic Four happens when they decide to take a rocket into space on an unofficial mission and become the first people in space. Remember, this was like 1960s, so 1961. I think it was 1961. So this would have been before even the Russians went into space, I think. And they get hit by cosmic rays. And it's established in the origin story that Ben Grimm warns Reed Richards that the ship isn't properly, shielded for cosmic rays, and this is something they need to watch out for. And everybody's really dismissive of Ben. So, of course, when the ship gets hit with cosmic rays, he's the one who gets turned into a monster, and everybody else gets cool superpowers. Ben's superpowers were cool, too, if, you don't mind being a big pile of orange rocks. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about Mr. Fantastic was the name, Mr. Fantastic. Obviously, the Human Torch is a human torch. The Invisible Girl is a girl that is invisible, and the Thing is a thing. But Mr. Fantastic's name is not very descriptive of his superpowers. You think they could have called him Mr. Elastic or something like that. I think the main thing was they wanted to tie his name in with the team, and that makes sense. But I always kind of figured that Mr. Fantastic was much more descriptive of the man as a whole rather than, his power set. And to me, I always thought that Mr. Fantastic's real superpower was his genius, and not necessarily his stretchy ability. And he always had that, even before he went up in the rocket. But like I said, the one thing he didn't take into account, the greatest mistake that Reed Richards ever made in the comic books, was that he didn't put enough plating onto that ship to protect them from the cosmic rays, and his best friend turned into a monster because of it. And I think a lot of the motivations that led Reed Richards after that was based on that guilt. He constantly talks about how, he's not going to rest until he's able to cure Ben of this condition and return him being a normal man. And you see him try and fail at doing that many times throughout the comic book. It's just like this one failure that keeps coming back to haunt him, and no matter what he does, no matter what brilliant things he's able to accomplish, he can never fix this one wrong that he did, and he carries that with him all the time. There's a more modern story where they kind of reinterpret it as the entire reason that Reed came up with the idea of them becoming the Fantastic Four was to try to help Ben cope with being turned into a monster and making him into something more than a monster and making him into a hero. Poor Ben Grimm. So, Reed Richards is married to Sue Storm. That's another interesting thing about these characters is that Stan would later talk about the illusion of change, but the Fantastic Four actually went through a lot of change in terms of their evolution. And in the earliest issues, Sue Storm is the fiancée of Reed Richards. And then a few years later, they actually get married. And towards the end of Stan and Jack's run, they actually have a son, Franklin. So there was actual real change going on in those stories. And his relationship with Sue is kind of interesting because, Reed could be kind of absent-minded and, get more caught up in his work and kind of forget about Sue, and she could be kind of resentful for it. I think this is why, like, in the early issues, you had kind of the love triangle between her and Reed and the Submariner, because the Submariner is a boiling cauldron of passion that is just, making it very clear to Sue and pursuing her and passionate. And, of course, she's going to be drawn to that. He's a prince, and he's handsome, and he lives under the ocean, and he's exotic, and he's cool, and Reed's just bottled up in his lab, but she can't ever get over her loyalty to Reed. I think that's some true love there. She might have been infatuated with the Submariner, but that was a passing fancy. Sorry, Namor. Don't worry, Subby did all right for himself. He had plenty of other love interests. But yeah, Sue tends to get a lot of attention because she's the one woman on the team. And, sometimes she's drawn to be eye candy. This is how it is. It's comic books. And, the Human Torch is a flashy sort of character that, all the kids wanted to be like. We all wanted to be cool and fix hot rods and fly around and, shoot fireballs. That's the kind of thing that appeals to a kid. And, of course, what kid wouldn't want to turn into a big orange monster and smash their enemies? We all loved Ben Grimm. Ben was our favorite. And he was I thought, the funny one. He was grumpy and everything, but he had a good heart and, never lost his sense of humor, even when he was at his lowest points. But Reed kind of gets swept by the wayside, and I think that's a shame because he's just as interesting a character as any of the other ones, and he deserves some attention. So I think they would probably do a lot better with Reed Richards if they would remember the roots of the character and that he's supposed to be just as much a man of action as he is supposed to be a thinker. I'd read in my Fantastic Four group, and shout out to people on my Fantastic Four group in Facebook. If you're watching this, give the video a thumbs up. Let me know you're there. But one of them had pointed out something that I thought was really insightful, which was that Reed was probably inspired by Doc Savage. And that made a lot of sense to me because Doc Savage is kind of like the ancestor of superheroes in a lot of ways. I think I mentioned him in the Superman video too. But in terms of being both a man of science and a man of action, and even drew parallels between Ben Grimm and Monk Mayfair, and his relationship with God, I'm drawing a blank on his name. Was it Ham, the lawyer guy? Ham, I think it was. And the banter and byplay between them was kind of similar to the banter and byplay between Ben and Johnny in Fantastic Four. So it really does all come back to Doc Savage. He probably one of the most influential characters you've never heard of. If you're watching this video, I'm not saying you haven't heard of Doc Savage. If you're watching my video, you're probably a little more knowledgeable than most. So, but we know about Doc Savage. We appreciate Doc Savage. He'll be one that I'll have to do a video on eventually and talk a lot about his influence. So, I don't know what I'm going to do for the next episode yet. I'm leaning on something in a Batman sort of direction. Maybe since I've talked about heroes a lot in this one, maybe I should talk about a villain. So, yeah, I think that's a good idea. So, anyway, thanks for watching if you hung around this long, and we'll see you next time. If you liked it, hit the like button. If you didn't like it, I guess just don't watch my videos anymore. Bye.